22 years. That's how long I gave this company, my nights, my loyalty, my life. And in one cold boardroom they erased all of it. I was fired. Replaced by a 30-year-old with a fresh MBA. My assistant. The woman I trained. They saw a 55-year-old black woman walking out in silence. And thought I was finished. What they didn't know was this. I wasn't just working for them all those years. I was studying them. And when I came back, it wasn't to ask for my job. It was to buy the company. I remember the exact weight of the manila envelope as it landed on my desk. It felt heavier than the combined years of service it represented. A tombstone made of recycled paper. Mr. Sterling, the CEO, a man whose children called me auntie and whose company I helped save from bankruptcy in '08, offered a platitude about streamlining and forward thinking, his smile tight and utterly porcelain. Beside him stood Zara, my brilliant, ambitious, and now utterly silent assistant of 5 years, clutching a leather binder like a shield, her eyes darting between me and the floor, a single, glistening bead of sweat tracing a path down her temple. I knew, in that sickening moment, that her silence was the loudest confession. They hadn't just cut me loose, they had orchestrated it, and the protégé I had poured all my knowledge into was the sharpest blade in the back. The 22 years I gave Sterling and Associates, the late nights, the missed anniversaries, the sheer blood and sweat of building their global outreach, flashed before my eyes, dissolving into a fine dust of contempt. I felt the familiar, fiery resolve of a black woman who has been told she is disposable one too many times, a fire that had been banked but never extinguished. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored suit jacket, my gaze locking onto Zara's, a silent promise passing between us, but the only question burning in my mind was, what was the real price she paid to sit in my chair? The severance package was a joke, a financial insult that confirmed their low opinion of my future worth. Offering just 6 months' pay and a non-compete clause so ludicrously restrictive it was clearly designed to keep me on the sidelines until I hit 60. They underestimated the meticulous filing system I had maintained over 2 decades, not just of company data, but of my own strategic and financial safety net, a private portfolio I had been building since my first promotion. While Mr. Sterling droned on about a clean transition, my mind was already several moves ahead on a very personal chessboard, running complex scenarios and calculating the precise timing of my next move. I nodded, I signed, I even offered a polite, professional handshake, every gesture a calculated performance of wounded compliance, masking the rapidly developing architectural plans for their utter destruction. As I gathered my personal effects, a framed photo of my deceased husband, a small bronze elephant for luck, I discreetly palmed a single, critical flash drive containing every off-the-books expense, every unverified acquisition, and every compromising email from the last decade. They thought they were sending me home to knit and despair, but they were actually funding my war chest. The non-compete was the one thing they insisted on. But what if my true return didn't involve competing at all? But something far more devastating? My final walk through the executive floor felt like attending my own funeral. But I was the only one who knew I would rise again. The pitying glances from the remaining staff were harder to bear than the CEO's smug satisfaction, confirming that the corporate grapevine had already declared me a relic, a casualty of the digital age. I stopped at the corner office, the one that used to be mine, and saw Zara's personal effects already strewn across the credenza, a sickening display of haste and arrogance. Her new status came with a significant cost, however, and I knew her hunger for power was a vulnerability I could exploit. I spent the next 3 weeks in self-imposed exile, not mourning, but intensely studying, using my quiet time to review the digital files I had taken, cross-referencing company expense reports with Sterling's personal accounts, and establishing a completely untraceable network of offshore holding companies. My husband's cousin, a brilliant but ethically ambiguous corporate lawyer in Geneva, became the essential, unseen hand in my elaborate plot. The non-compete clause kept me from working for a competitor, but it said absolutely nothing about owning one. The initial plan was simple: survival. The new plan, however, had transformed into an act of complete, meticulous, and delicious corporate revenge. I had the secrets, I had the funds, and now I just needed the perfect, silent vessel for my retribution. My lawyer, Maurice, a man whose silence was as expensive as his advice, confirmed what I had long suspected. Sterling and Associates was far more financially brittle than they let on, held together by a fragile web of leveraged debt and one colossal, unannounced acquisition in South America that was bleeding them dry. The internal documents on the flash drive confirmed the acquisition was a disaster, a massive risk only a desperate, greedy man like Sterling would attempt. This knowledge was pure, unadulterated power. I decided to strike at their foundation. I needed a proxy, a face, someone utterly clean and disconnected from my past at Sterling, and the answer came from an unlikely source, an old colleague, a former competitor named Elias, a charismatic but financially conservative man who had been unjustly ousted from his own company years prior, and now ran a small, struggling consultancy firm. A single, encrypted phone call was all it took to arrange a meeting at a secluded, private location far from the city. I laid out the plan, the cold hard facts of Sterling's vulnerability, and the potential for a massive targeted strike. A proposal that was less a partnership and more a very strategic, well-funded takeover. He listened, silent and intense, but as I finished, a single critical question still hung in the air. Would Elias's past resentment be strong enough to overcome his fear of my very audacious plan? Elias agreed to the partnership, his handshake firm, his eyes gleaming with a controlled, professional fury that matched my own. He would be the visible CEO, the phantom investor, and I the unseen architect, the silent majority shareholder who pulled the strings. Our first move was to strategically inject a massive untraceable capital infusion into his struggling consultancy, instantly transforming it into a formidable, resource-rich threat. The Ascendant Group. I focused the Ascendant Group's energy on targeting Sterling's South American disaster, offering superior consulting services, and more importantly, better financing to the local companies Sterling was trying to absorb. The pressure was immediate. Within weeks, I received an encrypted message from an old friend still working in Sterling's accounting department, a loyal soldier I'd kept in my pocket for years. Sterling was suddenly and frantically trying to secure a new, emergency line of credit. But the first major surprise wasn't the panic. It was the name of the bank they were aggressively pursuing. The same obscure, private bank in Monaco that handled my late husband's considerable estate, and which I had quietly retained significant, controlling interest in after his death. Sterling and Associates was about to walk right into a financial trap that I secretly owned. But how had Sterling known this very private bank was even an option for a company of his size? The discovery that Sterling was approaching my private bank in Monaco, a bank whose board I could influence with a single phone call, deepened the mystery and intensified the planning. This bank specialized in high-risk, high-reward international corporate financing, precisely the kind Sterling would need to cover his increasingly porous acquisition. I immediately called in a favor, instructing the bank's president to grant Sterling and Associates a meeting, to entertain the request, but to delay, stall, and demand an impossible amount of collateral and paperwork, creating a bureaucratic quagmire that would consume their time and resources. While Sterling was busy scrambling to satisfy the bank's demands, the Ascendant Group, under Elias's polished guidance, quietly swooped in and secured two major contracts that Sterling desperately needed to finalize his South American deal. The pressure was mounting, and I could practically feel Sterling's panic tightening the screws on his organization. My internal contact at Sterling and Associates then sent me another piece of cryptic information. An unusual, frequent series of large, personal expense reports filed by Zara, my former assistant, always categorized under executive travel, and always to a specific high-end resort in the Caribbean. A resort that was suspiciously close to a known hub for offshore corporate transactions. What secret was Zara hiding, and was her trip linked to Sterling's sudden knowledge of my private bank in Monaco? The repeated, secretive trips by Zara to the Caribbean resort were too frequent and too expensive to be mere relaxation. They signaled a deep, personal entanglement with Sterling's secretive financial dealings, a level of trust that went far beyond the professional. I had the Ascendant Group's security team quietly investigate the resort's guest logs and flight manifests, focusing on the dates Zara was there, cross-referencing them with Sterling's personal calendar. The results were electrifying. On 3 separate occasions, the logs showed that Mr. Sterling himself had been at the very same resort, on the very same dates as Zara, but always under a different alias and traveling on a private charter. The betrayal was no longer just professional. It was a deep, nauseating personal affront that confirmed a despicable, long-standing affair that had likely started while I was still training Zara, still treating her like a daughter. My gut churned with a cold mixture of hurt and rage, knowing that the man I'd helped build an empire for had been sleeping with my apprentice, conspiring against me even as I was mentoring her. The sheer audacity of their disrespect fueled my need for retribution. They had not only taken my job, but they had also mocked my loyalty, and now the revenge would be swift, precise, and personally ruinous. I decided it was time to move beyond strategic corporate pressure and execute a move that would strike at the very heart of their personal comfort. But how could I use this sickening affair to my corporate advantage? The revelation of Sterling and Zara's calculated, secretive affair provided the perfect, emotionally charged weapon I needed to disrupt their internal harmony. I couldn't just publicize the affair, as that would be too reckless and unstrategic. Instead, I opted for a highly targeted, calculated leak, sending an anonymous, non-traceable email to a single, notoriously puritanical member of Sterling and Associates Board of Directors, a woman who was also the former law partner of Sterling's long-suffering, estranged wife. The email contained only a few highly suggestive dates, the name of the Caribbean resort, and a link to a discreetly obtained, damning photo of Zara and Sterling walking hand in hand on the beach. The ensuing chaos was immediate, contained but incredibly destructive. A massive, internal rift was created on the board, distracting Sterling at the most critical time as he struggled to finalize his emergency loan and his disastrous acquisition. Elias, as CEO of the Ascendant Group, leveraged the distraction by aggressively buying up the available debt on Sterling's South American assets, driving up the interest rates and pushing Sterling and Associates to the brink of a liquidity crisis. Sterling was panicked, making increasingly desperate moves, selling off small but valuable parts of the company just to stay afloat. I had them in a slow, agonizing chokehold, but the thought of Zara, sitting smugly in my old office, still rankled. I needed to see her face to face, to witness her escalating anxiety, but how could I orchestrate a meeting that would appear completely accidental? My orchestrated accidental meeting with Zara took place at a high-profile industry networking gala, an event I knew Sterling and Associates desperately needed to attend to project an image of financial stability, which I, as the silent owner of the Ascendant Group, had also been invited to. I walked in, draped in a custom-made gown and jewels purchased with my severance money, radiating a quiet confidence that was a world away from the broken woman they had dismissed. I spotted Zara across the room first, clutching a glass of champagne, her face already etched with the stress of her new, demanding role, her eyes constantly scanning the room for Sterling, who was nowhere to be seen. I glided toward her, a predatory calm in my movements. She saw me, and the champagne glass almost slipped from her hand, the flicker of genuine fear and guilt in her eyes being more satisfying than any victory parade. "Zara," I said, my voice low and velvety smooth, "you look busy." She stammered out a practiced corporate lie about her new responsibilities, avoiding my gaze, trying to maintain her composure. I cut her off gently. "I hear the corporate travel is quite exhausting these days. Especially the trips to the Caribbean." The color drained from her face, and her perfectly crafted composure shattered. She knew I knew, and the power dynamic instantly reversed. The encounter was short, brutal, and served its purpose. I left her visibly shaken and paranoid, knowing that her secret life was no longer secure. But in her fear, she revealed a truth I hadn't expected. A detail about Sterling's panic that hinted at an even larger, more devastating betrayal yet to be uncovered. "Zara," in her state of shock and escalating panic during our encounter, let slip a crucial, almost mumbled detail about Sterling's current desperate state. He's trying to liquidate the legacy fund. It's all going to collapse. The legacy fund. That name hit me like a physical blow. It was a secret, long-standing, untouchable retirement and investment account. A multi-million-dollar fund that Sterling had personally assured me was protected for the long-term benefit of the company's oldest, most loyal employees, myself included. Its liquidation would be the ultimate, devastating betrayal, a final, catastrophic grab for cash that would not only prove his greed, but also leave dozens of longtime employees completely destitute. I instantly understood that my betrayal was not an isolated incident. It was part of a systemic, corporate-wide plot to loot the company for personal gain. He hadn't just fired me. He was preparing to rob my friends and former colleagues of their life savings. The rage I felt was no longer about my job. It was about justice and protecting the people he was about to hurt. I immediately tasked Maurice and Elias with preparing a comprehensive legal countermove, utilizing the information I had gathered on Sterling's secret bank accounts and the disastrous South American deal, to freeze the fund's assets before he could raid it. The game was no longer about ownership. It was about the ethical soul of the company. But there was one last piece of information that Zara hadn't given up. Who else on the board knew about Sterling's plan to raid the fund? And who was actively helping him? The only way to definitively stop Sterling's imminent raid on the legacy fund was to activate the highest legal leverage possible. And for that, I needed more than just documents. I needed a credible, internal whistleblower. I contacted my loyal accounting friend one last time, making an appeal not for me, but for the dozens of other employees whose lives were about to be ruined by Sterling's avarice. My contact, a woman named Janice, a sweet, mild-mannered woman who had also been with the company for 20 years, finally agreed, sending me a massive encrypted file containing the complete transaction records, proving Sterling's intent to illegally transfer the fund's assets offshore. The files also contained the definitive, shocking evidence of complicity. It wasn't just Sterling and Zara involved in the plot. A respected, longtime board member and two high-ranking executive VPs were also involved, their names appearing on the internal authorization memos, forming a criminal inner circle that had been systematically dismantling the company from the inside. This level of coordinated rot went far beyond simple corporate mismanagement. It was a full-scale RICO case waiting to happen. The scale of the conspiracy made my job simpler and more devastatingly effective, allowing me to strike at multiple targets simultaneously. The Ascendant Group, fueled by my strategic capital, was now perfectly positioned to not just acquire assets, but to become the official savior of Sterling and Associates. But how would the current, corrupt board react when my lawyer and I walked into their emergency meeting with the undeniable evidence of their crimes? The stage was set for the final, unforgettable confrontation. Elias, as the figurehead of the Ascendant Group, had formally offered to purchase Sterling and Associates' crippling South American debt at a favorable, but binding rate, forcing the beleaguered board to call an emergency meeting to discuss the hostile-friendly takeover. I arranged to meet Elias 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, handing him a sealed envelope containing the whistleblowing documents and the legal paperwork that would officially freeze the legacy fund and initiate a full SEC investigation into Sterling's activities. When Elias, Maurice, and I arrived at the Sterling and Associates headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with desperation and barely concealed contempt. We were ushered into the same mahogany-paneled boardroom where I had been dismissed just months before. Sterling, looking haggard and panicked, sat at the head of the table, flanked by the board members, including the three co-conspirators. Zara sat beside him, pale and visibly terrified. Elias opened the meeting with a practiced, calm demeanor, discussing the debt restructuring, but I remained strategically silent, an observer. Sterling, sensing his control slipping, launched into a pathetic, desperate diatribe about loyalty and how the Ascendant Group was taking advantage of a temporary dip. It was the perfect cue for my entrance, an act that would shatter their last illusion of power. I raised my hand, interrupting Sterling mid-sentence, and offered a simple, cutting, and entirely unexpected question that brought the entire boardroom to a stunned, silent halt. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice projecting a resonant, chilling clarity that cut through the tension. "Before we proceed with the Ascendant Group's offer to acquire the debt, I have a single, pressing question. Who exactly do you think you are speaking to?" Sterling, bewildered by my interruption, stared at me with pure confusion. You're that woman who used to work here," he stammered, the realization only half formed. "Yes," I replied, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. "But that's not my official capacity today. Today, I am the chairwoman of the Ascendant Group's Shadow Corporate Board, the majority shareholder behind the acquisition of your most critical debt, and the woman who personally authorized the immediate freeze on your legacy fund." I reached into my custom suit jacket, pulling out the official legal documentation, heavy with gold seals and signatures, and slid it across the table toward Sterling. The moment the document landed, announcing the SEC investigation and the asset freeze, was the moment I reclaimed my power. The color drained from Sterling's face. Zara let out a small, terrified gasp, and the three co-conspirator board members suddenly looked like deer caught in headlights. The boardroom descended into immediate, chaotic shouting, but the game was already over. I hadn't just returned as a client. I had returned as the executioner of their financial freedom. I had all the cards, but I was not yet finished with the most satisfying part of the revenge, the quiet, devastating move that would wipe the smug look off of Zara's face for good. The emergency meeting quickly dissolved into a furious, panicked legal disaster. Maurice, my brilliant lawyer, efficiently handed the three complicit board members and Sterling their termination notices and subpoenas, citing irrefutable evidence of financial malfeasance and fiduciary irresponsibility. Sterling, sputtering threats and denials, was escorted out of the building by a private security team hired by the Ascendant Group, his reign ending not with a bang, but with a humiliating whimper. Then came the moment I had waited for, dealing with Zara. I walked over to my old chair, the one she now occupied, and leaned down, looking her directly in her tear-filled, horrified eyes. "You took the ladder I offered you and used it to try and burn the whole house down," I whispered, my voice thick with justified anger. "You never understood that loyalty is the only currency that matters." I didn't fire her. I simply informed her that her massive unearned compensation package was being immediately retracted due to the complicity in the legacy fund conspiracy, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a severely damaged corporate reputation. She was escorted out, passing the staff who watched in stunned silence, a complete reversal of our positions just months prior. The victory was complete, but as I sat in the chair that was once mine, now temporarily secured by the legal maneuvers of the Ascendant Group, a small, crucial detail still nagged at the back of my mind. A detail in Sterling's personal correspondence that suggested he wasn't acting alone, but that he was taking orders from someone far more powerful, someone I knew. With Sterling and his inner circle purged in the Ascendant Group, through Elias, positioned as the company's stabilizing savior, the media declared a dramatic, corporate turnaround. I was the unseen power, the silent chairwoman, orchestrating the restoration of Sterling and Associates' integrity and the replenishment of the legacy fund, a phoenix rising from the ashes of corporate greed. Yet the final, most chilling piece of the puzzle remained unsolved. Reviewing the last of Sterling's encrypted personal files, I discovered a series of financial transfers he had made years ago, large, regular payments to an anonymous holding company in the Caymans. The account's beneficiary was listed only by a cryptic code name, Auntie M. The sheer size and longevity of the payments suggested not a personal debt, but a retainer, a controller, someone who had been pulling Sterling's strings for years. The name Auntie M immediately triggered a terrifying memory. It was the private, affectionate nickname that Sterling and his children used for my late husband's former business partner, a woman who had mysteriously disappeared from the corporate world years ago after a bitter, secretive lawsuit. Was she the true puppet master? Had she used Sterling to destroy my life and company? The betrayal ran deeper than I ever imagined. A generational feud disguised as corporate malfeasance. I was back. I had won the battle. But the war against a shadowy figure who knew all my husband's secrets and seemed intent on completing a decades-old plan was just beginning. The true enemy was still out there, waiting in the shadows, and my greatest challenge was knowing who was Auntie M, and how I could possibly stop her next move.